What were the lessons of the Corbyn years? There are no simple answers to this, and if someone gives you a simple answer, it's going to be wrong. And what I'll try and do this evening is to highlight both the serious errors that were made by our leadership and sections of the left, and, just as importantly, the immensity of the obstacles we faced. These underlying factors, the context, the objective conditions, do not always excuse mistakes, but they certainly help to explain them. Now, what happened in September 2015 when Jeremy won the leadership was a shifting of the tectonic plates. Of course, the change in the electoral system for electing the Labour leader, passed after Ed Miliband's Collins review, was crucial. Now it was one member, one vote, no electoral college, no votes for MPs, and now votes for registered supporters. It was one member, one vote for affiliated trade union members as well. So confident were the right, so dismissive of the left, that they had forgotten the words of Richard Crossman more than half a century ago, that the right of the Labour Party keeps control in two ways, through the independence of the Parliamentary Labour Party and the trade union bloc vote. That voting base had now been eroded. But it wasn't just the historical accident of the Collins review that won it for Jeremy. The world outside was changing. In Greece, the rise of Syriza. In Spain, Podemos. And in the United States, Bernie Sanders. The years of stability had been broken by the economic crisis of 2008. As we know, it's conditions that determine consciousness. Just as the First World War was the precondition for the Russian Revolution, the 1929 crash the precondition for Hitler's rise to power, so too the 2008 crash undermined the stability that sustained new Labour and moderate bourgeois governments and brought in its wake the radical movements of the left and the populist movements of the right. Now, when Jeremy won the Labour leadership, the odds were always massively against us. Our party and our movement were fighting a number of external obstacles. The state, with veiled threats by generals to overturn a democratically elected radical Labour government. The media, the Tories, the power of big business. And all of this in the context of a vote on Brexit that put Labour between a rock and a hard place, and the near death of Labour Scotland that would take years to recover from whoever was Labour leader. The decline in Labour support in Scotland arose from years of neglect, taking support for Labour for granted, the joint campaign of the Tories on independence, and the generally right-wing nature of many Labour councils, although this was a problem by no means limited to Scotland. But we were fighting specifically internal obstacles too, those forces which reflected the power of the establishment within our own ranks. Firstly, the machinery of the party, the undemocratic structures and rules of the party, with the right-wing dominated compliance unit, as it was then called, a party within a party being used to suspend hundreds of Corbyn supporters. And two, the Parliamentary Labour Party, shamefully refusing to accept the party's overwhelming vote for Jeremy, briefing against him, forcing a second leadership contest. It was acting as another party within a party and fearing a Corbyn government more than any Tory government. It was obvious from the outset that the PLP and the Labour bureaucracy would be serious obstacles to any programme of fundamental change. And I go further. A precondition for challenging the establishment forces from outside was to take on the forces of the establishment within our party. It was inconceivable that the parliamentary party, unless fundamentally transformed, would ever, in its majority, be an ally for socialist transformation. And yet there was this problem. Unlike, say, Bernie Sanders in the United States, Jeremy had to operate day to day in a parliamentary framework, putting together a parliamentary opposition within a hostile PLP. He and John McDonnell were embattled on the front line from the very start. So the only possible way to fight against such powerful opposition forces from within was to build an anti-establishment insurgency from below, beginning with an early shakeout of the party bureaucracy, removing McNichol as General Secretary. Starmer, if he's shown us one thing, he has shown us how that can be done. But the problem is this was not the late 60s, 70s and early 80s when the working class in Britain was powerful. So powerful that Heath called an election in 1974 on the theme of who rules, the government or the unions, and he lost. We have suffered decades of defeat since the miners' strike. And although Jeremy's victory reflected in part a genuine disaffection from below against austerity and neoliberalism, part of an international movement such as in Spain, Greece and the United States, at the same time, our movement was at a low ebb. And this was the key contradiction between the rise of the most left-wing leadership in Labour's history, and that's what it was, and the low ebb of class struggle. So our task was to rebuild the movement, utilising our leadership of the party to help do so. It needed a democratic grassroots movement, rooted in our trade unions and in our communities, that would have to try openly and transparently to transform the party itself. That insurgency had to be a radical crusade against the establishment and an authentic voice for the dispossessed. But here was the conflict, how to achieve that while at the same time achieving some unity within the PLP and shadow cabinet sufficient to keep the parliamentary opposition on the road. There were two aims, party unity and the building of a radical democratic grassroots movement. How could those opposites be reconciled? And this was the nub of the problem. And that tension, exacerbated by the political degeneration and incorporation of momentum, now reached a critical point. After the split by the Gang of Nine, Labour MPs who defected, Jeremy had almost impossible choices. He feared another parliamentary split that could make a general election, even against the weak, split, crisis-ridden Tory government, desperately difficult. And yet, to abandon the radical grassroots movement to the power of the parliamentary party was to give up in advance on the chance of a lifetime of achieving a radical Labour government. So facing those dilemmas, where did the left succeed? To a limited extent, there were three partial gains. The first on policy, culminating in the high point of the Corbyn years, the 2017 manifesto. It was by no means a revolutionary, transformative programme, but compared to what had preceded it, it was surprisingly radical, especially in its break with austerity and neoliberalism and in its break with support for imperialist wars. And it played a role in a relatively positive performance in the 2017 general election. The second was that a degree of left unity was achieved, sufficient to win NEC elections and some conference decisions supporting the leadership. And in its early period, momentum showed signs that it could become the embryo of the grassroots movement that was required. Thirdly, of course, was the transformation of the party into a mass membership party of over 600,000, the biggest party in Western Europe. But ultimately, the left, we, failed to deliver. Why? Above all, it was political weakness and a failure to give political leadership. Against huge establishment pressure, above all from the parliamentary party and party bureaucracy, the left began to divide and crumble on key issues, such as fighting the witch hunt and on open selection of MPs. The significance of this should not be underestimated. Key allies of the left and key objectives to transform the party were sacrificed in a vain attempt to appease the right. Now, I'm going to give some focus to the witch hunt, not because it was the most important issue, which arguably it wasn't, but because it remains the elephant in the room, a subject to be avoided. The reason is obvious. Sections of the left at various times colluded with and appeased the witch hunt. It was a witch hunt primarily based on mainly false, exaggerated allegations of anti-Semitism, allegations which we failed to challenge and which I, as a Jew, found and still find deeply offensive. I saw and I felt the pain at close quarters when my partner Jackie Walker was removed as vice chair of Momentum, suspended twice from the party, and finally a couple of years later expelled, primarily because she dared to argue that Holocaust Memorial Day should be extended to include Holocausts other than just the Jewish Holocaust. What an irony that only 2 weeks ago, this point was echoed by Chief Rabbi Mervis. We saw it too with Ken Livingstone, probably the best anti-racist leader of our movement that we've ever produced, for daring to refer to the Havara Agreement, by which some Zionist leaders in the 30s helped to undermine the movement to boycott Nazi Germany. Ken was vilified by the leader of Momentum, and a leading Labour left MP told him on television to be contrite. And then there was Chris Williamson, thrown out for stating the bleeding obvious, that our party had apologised too much for allegations of anti-Semitism that had little foundation. And then the ludicrous spectacle of Jeremy Corbyn himself, anti-racist to his core, attacked by Margaret Hodge for being, quotes, a fucking anti-Semite. And she was allowed to do so with impunity. But if there was one moment that showed that the party and the left was losing its way, it was at the launch of the Chakrabarti report. Just remember this. It was a report into anti-Semitism and other forms of racism. Mark Wadsworth challenged the fact that Black voices and any narrative of anti-Black racism were silenced. Now, what should the reaction of the party and the left have been? Shame that what he said was true? Recognition of what he said? Solidarity? No, he was expelled. And from so much of the left, not a murmur. We failed on the witch hunt and on open selection too. And we failed to build a movement for change as the leadership became imprisoned in a parliamentary fight that could only have been won by pressure from below. And in all of these failures, Momentum became more and more part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Now, there are those who proclaim that the deficiencies of the left were the critical reason for the ultimate failure of the Corbyn project. I'm not convinced these factors were decisive, but they were a factor certainly. The combination of the bureaucratized trade union left around Unite and the top-down, unaccountable Momentum leadership, at times supporting the witch hunt and the false narratives about anti-Semitism in our party, and staging a coup to abolish any democratic accountable structures. Above all, this left failed to defend members unjustly witch hunted, including Jeremy himself when under the greatest attack. All of this despite Momentum's undoubted achievement in mobilising members for general elections. Their methods were a product of years when the left was marginalised and totally unsuited to the upsurge of the Labour left and the new vibrant membership of more than 500,000. Now, the question we faced and still do is this: how to rebuild a left in the party, in the unions, in the wider movement, in the broader community that is both politically sharp enough to avoid incorporation into the bureaucracy, yet broad enough to reach the mass of our membership and beyond, and avoid being just another small sect. Now, we failed, but the criticisms I've made tonight need themselves to be put into perspective, because we faced, in any event, enormous pressures given the objective balance of forces. It's so easy to criticise in retrospect, not so easy to put right at the time, though some problems, as I have indicated, were obvious from the outset. But we should be suspicious of easy soundbites, that if only we'd done this or that on Brexit, for example, disaster could have been avoided. Not so, in my opinion. For example, within an hour of the exit poll at the time of the general election in December 2019, I received 2 messages. The first said, we lost because Jeremy embraced the second referendum. The second, that we lost because we were not sufficiently in the Remain camp. Both wrong, in my opinion, both underestimating how toxic Brexit was. There were material reasons for this: the weakening of class identity and how vulnerable, therefore, class was to the myth of national identity, to an English nationalism rooted in the imperial past. This loss of class identity was itself rooted in the defeats of the last 40 years, the breakdown of working class communities, the shrinking of public services, something for which Labour in national and local government must take its full share of responsibility. Yep, Jeremy's fudge on Brexit didn't work, but neither, in my opinion, would either of the alternatives. Ditto on the witch hunt. I think the failure on the witch hunt was itself part of a greater failure to stand up to the forces of the establishment within the party. So we need to be careful not to create our own left-wing soundbites. The problems were indeed profound. Yes, we had to rebuild our movement, but that would take time and would need not only a movement from below, but the assistance of a Labour government too. Yes, we needed an insurgency against the parliamentary party, removing the many MPs who would be an obstacle to our programme. But this may have had consequences. Many deselected MPs would have stood against Labour. The spectre of electoral annihilation of 1931 proportions would have been a real possibility. And where would the international support come from? Socialism in one country is a contradiction in terms. And by 2019, the left in Europe and the United States was in retreat. And yes, the insurrection from below required a leadership of revolutionary proportions. However inspiring Jeremy's leadership was, it was never that. Nor did that leadership come from within the left, within the party. Too much time was spent avoiding anything which may be construed as criticism of Jeremy. An early example was around the issue of Trident, a party conference, where there were mixed messages from the top on whether the left should prioritise resolutions for the scrapping of Trident. The issue then disappeared from the left's agenda for the whole of the Corbyn period. But whatever these obstacles, and they were real, it remains the case for a determined socialist leadership and for the left within the party. There was no alternative to taking on the power of the establishment within the party. A major failing of momentum, and others on the left, including ourselves, who were not able to fill the gap, was the lack of political education on the nature of socialism and the Labour Party, and crucially, the centrality of the organised working class. This led to major problems, such as Momentum arguing briefly for a reduction of union representation on the NEC, and local activists rejecting the importance of trade union representation in CLPs. And when Momentum did take up political education through the World Transformed at conference, it tended to be a diversion from interaction with party conference down the road, and refused to tackle some of the most contentious issues. And I certainly have memories when ideas which myself and Jackie and others at the World Transform were trying to put forward were actually silenced. Its education tended to be centred mainly around policy issues alone, rather than about how we achieve those policies. Another crucial lesson is that while the left must be supportive of left leaders, it must also be independent politically of them and willing to disagree when necessary, in a comradely fashion, of course. The failure to support open selection by Unite and Momentum stem precisely from this desire to not disagree with Jeremy, rather than to do and say what was necessary. Working closely with the trade unions, and not just their leaderships, must be a central platform of the left. Too often, sections of the left see their role as organising the constituency left and leaving the trade unions to their own devices, or at best talking only to general secretaries. So where are we now? We are in a critical position, facing setback and isolation. The government attempting to make the working class pay for COVID. The right-wing Starmer-Evans regime in the Labour Party declaring war on the membership. And in preparing our resistance, we need to learn the difficult political lessons from the Corbyn years, or we will be doomed to repeat those errors, as we are, I fear, already beginning to do. So what do we do now? One, politically educate ourselves and our movement on much sharper political and theoretical foundations. Two, develop alliances with all those in struggle, in the trade unions and beyond, to build the resistance to this government. Three, to try to help coordinate the various movements of resistance. Inside the party, of course, with the growing demand now for a recall Labour Party conference, but also beyond the party as well, because it is only by helping to renew the forces of class struggle and connecting to these forces as a visible Labour left that we can ever succeed in fighting back in the party itself. Thank you, comrades.